and this is from Jeff. So how do we ensure longer and more and complex crop rotation systems? Seems hard for even organic field crop farmers to do, much less non-organic farmers.
I think this is one of the fundamental questions of our day. It's what I think that we need to have policies that make it economically feasible for farmers to grow more small grains that then allow you to have a diverse cover crops. And obviously, if you have a market for a fresh market, if you diversify your markets, sometimes that can help. But I agree, it's a real challenge. And I think that it helps all of society. So we should be making it more feasible for farmers to grow diverse crops, because then you can grow diverse cover crops and meet multiple objectives.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Jacob. Are these poultry manure statistics for raw manure or composted manure?
So the first one was for raw and the second was for composted. But in both cases, the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio problem, to get enough nitrogen from poultry compost or manure, you're putting on too much phosphorus. So you should rely on other things in addition for your nitrogen sources, I would say. The pH varies. It depends on how the poultry are fed. So you have to test it for yourself. It should come with any compost you buy, the information on the pH, but you can also test it pretty easily with strips, color strips, or sending it off for analyses. Worth doing once in a while, just like you test your soil, test your main manure source. Why not?
I would remind everybody to put questions in the chat box if you'd still like to ask a question, or you can unmute yourself and ask it live. I do have a question. You had mentioned the 3 different plant types as kind of a minimum for diversity. Are you suggesting the grass, one from as a grass, as a legume, or as a brassica, as 3 different plant types, or how do you see that?
There's sometimes benefits to having more than one within a family, like you might want 2 types of grasses, but generally trying to make sure you have different families represented is really good, I think. So if you do something like, usually you go for at least one legume, at least one grass, and then you could, if you wanted to do something, with good pollinators, you might go for buckwheat. If you're trying to reduce your disease problems, you might go for a brassica. So it really depends on your objectives, but just trying to diversify not just the species or variety, but also the family is a really good goal.
Just to kind of follow up, do you think of the warm season versus cool season in any of those families?
I'd like to. It depends on what time of the year, what window you're trying to fit it into, which you prefer. Like mustards, brassicas, generally rapeseed, all of them tend to be easier to fit into a spring into a fall, because your soil's already warm. They really don't get going in a cold soil. So it depends on the time of year. But if you have a summer grass and then can follow it with a winter grass, that is some diversity too. So that's a good point.
Okay, there's a couple more questions come in the chat box. One from Les. If you apply manure to the surface of living cover, how much N loss will you experience, and P loss will surface and P loss with surface stratification?
So this is really will depend on the situation, but actually with living cover, you reduce some of your surface stratification because your roots again will pull up some nutrients. It depends. If you have diverse roots, some deep roots, then you can kind of prevent stratification problems and you prevent loss because you get good infiltration. If you have a root, water will follow that and nutrients will follow that. Then the roots will absorb it. So you won't get multiple different ways that water will and the nutrients will move. So, and manure will move. So I think there's multiple benefits of living cover. It would really depend exactly on your soil texture and your slope, obviously, how much loss you can prevent.
Okay, Cassandra has a question. What tests or observations do you recommend farmers use to track gains in soil organic matter?
Oh, that's a really good question, Cassandra. So I have given whole talks on this, including in this series or a similar series, but basically you want to make sure you measure really well once in a while for organic matter, say once in 3 years or 5 years. Don't try and do it every year, because your soil organic matter takes time before you can see changes, right? It really uh, requires careful measurement, because how you actually take the sample, like if you happen to sample where there was a little bit of manure last year, that might alter it. So you want to make sure you have a representative sample, carefully done, hopefully at different levels, not just the topsoil, over multiple years. And you also want to compare, if you can, to some sort of fence post or something nearby that is kind of your best soil, so you can say, am I moving in a positive trajectory or negative? So am I gaining organic matter? It'll take a number of years before you can start to say whether you have or not, because sometimes it'll look like it'll fluctuate every year. So it's better to do it carefully once every 3 to 5 years than to do it a little bit every year. And so I know there's different things out there being promoted, and I think we're developing better active organic matter ways to track, but I think just total organic matter, soil organic matter from any reputable lab, done carefully once every, say, 4 years, is the best way to go. It takes time, but it takes patience to build organic matter. And then you'll have real confidence that you've built your organic matter if you use the classic total organic matter.
Okay, I've got a question came in. A person's new to this and they have an orchard. How do you increase organic matters from living roots without creating competition uh, for resources?
Right, like you saw with the Martin Diffley's,
Yeah.
where he has actually managed to grow wheat between. But I must say, some organic farmers have been very smart about this. But it does take a lot of being timely management, different like ridge tillage systems, and um, careful mowing. So I don't think it's for the faint of heart. You have to be very careful, or something can get out of control. Particularly organic farmers that don't have chemical tools to get on top of weeds. But if they have a good weed management system like mowing, or some of the different burning approaches people are starting to use, and a good rotational system to reduce their buildup of perennial weeds, then people can manage to do it. But they have to have a plan. In fact, any cover crop, I would say, it's not so much how you plant it as thinking about how are you going to manage it once you get it going, particularly things like rye. They can get away from you in the spring. So having a good management plan for how you're going to incorporate it in the spring is you want to start from the beginning, having a plan.
Very good, Sig. We're really getting the pump primed here, so I'm kind of excited about these questions coming in. From one from Justin. Human dimension, in your opinion, why are farmers not more aggressively improving soil quality attributes at a landscape level that we are discussing today? My question encompasses all field and forage cropping systems, not just organic production system. What, in your opinion, needs to happen to execute at the landscape and national level related to improving soil health?
Wow, big question.
I hope I got it right.
Yeah, right. So I would come back to that crop diversity question, and I see there's another question about perennial crops coming up. I think we need to see more attention to promotion of, uh, it's great that farmers are adopting conservation tillage, but now we need to promote cover crops on a whole nother level, and whole landscape design. We have support from NRCS on that, but we need to have policies in place. Get a little philosophical on you. We need to see diversify the cropping system rotation, make it more practical and feasible for farmers to have pastures. So that means getting consumers involved who are willing to or interested in buying pasture raised beef. I think we need to see more crop livestock integration. That doesn't mean you have to be on a farm, but nearby farmers. We've seen there are cases where potato and dairy farmers have made contracts between them to rotate around their land. Well, why not facilitate that? Why not incentivize that at the policy level? So we diversify the landscape at multiple levels. That's ultimately how we'll get soil health, because cover crops is great, conservation tillage is great, but to fit that into a farm plan and a whole landscape level, you need to also have diverse markets and diversity of crop rotations going on. So I think we need to see some transformations in terms of incentives that go all the way to what crops are grown, so that then you can diversify further on that solid base, and crops and livestock.
Very good. We got two more, then we probably need to split into our meeting rooms. How might biochar influence your ideas? This is from JJ.
So biochar has, I mean, really, we're talking about so many different things when we get to biochar. Uh, it really depends on how it's made and what is the source, how sustainable it is. Certain areas, I know farmers have figured out how to, they grow a lot of trees, so it might be appropriate for some parts of the north central region where we grow a lot of trees in some areas, where it could be feasible. Other areas, I just feel it's been oversold. So I think it really matters, how your source is, how it's made, whether and how it improves your soil. So it should be, I think, experimented with, but as yet, I think living roots have actually proven much more reliable in terms of improving soil health, and compost in combination with living roots. That's a proven technology. Biochar has been worked in certain circumstances, um, but I wouldn't, for example, buy a lot of biochar. You can't buy enough, for example. You really would have to produce it on your own farm. So that comes back to having the right trees and having the right biochar plants to make it. So it's still early days, I would say, with biochar in terms of a practical amendment. I'm not saying very specialized use might work, but I'm talking about bigger picture.
Okay, very good question. Very good answer. I'm going to jump down to Jeff comments. Biochar usually works best on lower quality soils. And yes,
Yeah,
be sure it's of a
sustainably.
sustainable source. So I'm going to jump back up to a question. How do we accomplish getting back to a 7 to 10 year crop rotation where a perennial crop persists several years?
I see two solutions to that. One is this having more pasture raised animals so that we have a demand for forages and pastures. That gets us back into a perennial. So that's kind of a market linkage. The other one is something I've been privileged to work on, and that's perennial grains. If we could produce a perennial wheat, still early days, but I wish that there would be a lot more money put into that than do some of these other types of mechanisms, because perennial grain, can you imagine we could replace some corn and soybean eventually with some sort of perennial crop that would give us a crop every year. It is obviously it's a Manhattan type project. I mean, it would require a lot because the breeders haven't yet come up with really reliable. There's Kernza, which is actually intermediate wheatgrass, but it is not very high yielding yet. There's not many markets yet. But perennial wheat, um, it really showed a lot of promise. It reduced nitrate leaching when I got to do some experiments with it. It improved soil organic matter. The problem was it wasn't always perennial, and then it became a pathetic wheat, right? It wasn't as high yielding. It was like half as high yielding. So we still have a ways to go with perennial grains, but with breeders, with the tools they have these days, they could produce some perennial grains if they were given research dollars to do that. And agronomists like myself, we could improve soil health, and then ultimately, of course, it would be for farmers. So that would expand our repertoire. It wouldn't be just perennial forages, although they're very important, and cover crops. We would then have perennial grains as well as crop livestock integration. So there's a lot of things coming down the pike, and then some things we have right now that can improve soil health. But I think we need to incentivize with markets. And then I see there's someone interested in, if farmers were given payment for carbon sequestration. I haven't mentioned that because there really hasn't been any solid examples of carbon markets yet. But I think ultimately, yeah, farmers need to be paid for carbon sequestration type practices, such as these soil health practices we've been talking about today, and they need to be provided diverse markets. So it takes a whole village to make this work, I think.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We're gonna stop and appreciate your presentation, Sig, and your answers to those questions.